Extras. When Little One defeated Marp in that epic and unlikely duel, the orc dropped some pretty decent gear. He had that amazing sword. He also would have had an adamantine hammer if my pre-duel event had gone off. But it didn't, so they didn't get that. But he also had amazing orc scorpion armor. Now, I had figured out orc craftsmanship is a little bit different, because the orcs they had to figure out their own ways to do things. So they often did things in a way that more educated craftspeople would never even consider. But it means that they end up with gear which is relatively efficient in terms of having a bunch of abilities relative to the cost, but they often had drawbacks, and they would get stuff like, in this particular case, this armor, it's +2 armor, right? But kind of not, because normally +2 armor, that's a +2 enhancement bonus. The armor that Marp had was a +1 enhancement bonus and a +1 natural armor bonus, which, when you're low level, doesn't matter at all, but later on it would start to catch up with you, because if you had normal +2 armor, you could also get yourself an Amulet of Natural Armor, and it would stack. But in this case, the Amulet of Natural Armor wouldn't help you unless it was bigger than +1, and even then, you wouldn't be getting the +1 Natural Armor from the Orc Scorpion Armor. I thought it was pretty cool. It had that minor acid resistance, and yeah, it gave you a penalty to your fortitude saves. It wasn't the end of the world. And yeah, if it got wet, its bonuses were reduced until it dried off. The orcs don't care about that. It's not a big deal in the desert. So, you know, that all seemed fine. It was like, okay, here's a way. Black's going to get this good upgrade, and Little One's going to get this awesome upgrade. And of course, there's nothing weird or wrong about the sword that Marp had, because it wasn't crafted by orcs. It was actually an Eladrin blade, which has somehow found its way into his hands. And being Eladrin, it was made of cold iron, because that works pretty well against a lot of things that exist in the Feywild, where the Eladrin come from in my setting. So I was really kind of flabbergasted when Black didn't take the armor. Now, he didn't take the armor because in character it didn't make sense. It's like an RP thing. This is not something that he would wear, even if statistically it was superior to the, +1 basic full plate that he had. But it's just one of those things that I didn't anticipate that at all. I was like, here's this good armor that you get. You're like, what do you mean you're not taking it? Like, yeah! Overall, the orc encounter was designed to go in a certain way, and even ignoring that pre-duel duel that didn't happen that I mentioned last time, the whole encounter didn't go down as I expected at all. Because I figured, even if one of the PCs dueled Marp, it would either turn into a big brawl as they stepped in, or the PC would just die if he kept to an honorable duel. Marp was 2 levels higher and well optimized, and, I mean, you could see how close it was, and that included Marp, rolling a 1 on one of his attacks early on. The outcome of the fight was unlikely at best. The actual way that I had intended the whole orc encounter, apart from teaching the PCs that orcs were badass, that part worked. And I love the idea of getting them to kind of fear the orcs, to be at least worried about them. They're like, once they start realizing, finding their place in the world, and once I get that information across to them, that they start being like, holy crap, there are 3 orcs. What are we going to do? I also just sort of love the idea that these 3 guys would walk up to a city. City has hundreds and hundreds of people, at least a couple dozen guards, probably more than that. I don't want to figure it out exactly. Dozens of dwarven guards. I mean, Don DeCorso has a wizard on staff. Not like a really powerful one, and he's kind of non-combat guy, but it's still a wizard. They have all this stuff, and a town, and walls, and these 3 guys would walk up and say, yo, these are our demands, and if you don't give them to us, consider yourself under siege. So that's all badass. And the way it was kind of supposed to go down was either the players would not duel them, or one of the players would duel them and die. And yeah, if that happened, they would probably end up getting into a big group fight, which is not ideal. But I was just sort of hoping that it would come down to this thing where the players would be in the city and would be slightly intimidated or concerned about going out to fight the orcs, especially if they got to see the duel with the dwarf that was supposed to happen and show, holy crap, these orcs are serious. The idea was that it would give the players a chance to actually deal with the siege. The town they had already earned DeCorso's trust to a great degree, so they would have had a lot of leeway in terms of directing the town if they had any kind of plans they wanted to build. I wanted to give them a chance to come up with ways to defend the town, or any recommendations for what they wanted the guards to do. And of course, as the sun sets and the orcs start getting bored, at night, Naf, who was more of a light combatant, quick, stealthy, would actually raid the city. He would manage to sneak in, get over the walls, and start fires, and then escape again. And that would have been interesting. Eventually, if the PCs couldn't put together a response that works, or if they let it go too long, the orcs would actually go down to... There's a river on the far side of the town from the gate. It's called the River of Gears. And it starts, like, much further south in the Dwarven country, but this river, by the time it gets to DeCorso's Chasm, it has dug its own deep chasm beside the town. So the river is actually far below the level of the town, like 80 feet down or something. The dwarves have built stairs down there, and they have kind of like a pump set up. The town does have a well, but most of the water for the town comes by being pumped up from the River of Gears down there. So if the siege went on for a couple days, the orcs would eventually say, like, okay, we're just going to go down there and mess stuff up. So they would go down and just kind of threaten to pump, and the players would figure this out or get warned of it by the guards and be sent down there, and they would have to fight. They would be forced to confront the orcs down by the raging river, like down the stairs and that. And I thought that would have been kind of a cool sight for an encounter and stuff like that. Obviously what happened was completely and utterly different. So some of the NPC chatter on the road as they were traveling down south to Ginneron, which was a long piece of travel that I had to kind of space out, I didn't want to fast forward the whole thing, because then they wouldn't get the feeling that we traveled hundreds of miles and it took a month. One of the things that came up in conversation with the dwarves was the matter of Eldritch Eyes, and I was sort of dropping it right in there, kind of in-game, but I also explained to them out-of-game that, yeah, when you get high enough level to cast teleport, you can't just do it at will. You have to get this semi-rare component. You have to kill a relatively powerful abomination and take its eye or eyes, or however many would actually count. Abominations are weird and often have lots of eyes, so it totally depends what kind, how many of the eyes would actually count, or whether they would count at all. But the point was, you can't teleport at will. You can teleport. Teleport takes a minute to cast, and any teleport-like spell that is higher level. It still takes a minute to cast, and you have to expend one of these Eldritch Eyes to do so. And the problem with Eldritch Eyes is not just that you have to have them. It's not just, okay, this is a cost, you just spend one of these to do it. They cause this huge logistical problem, because it takes one Eldritch Eye to teleport. But any eyes that you bring with you when you teleport are also expended. So if you had 4 Eldritch Eyes, you spend one of them to teleport, you would have 3, right? But when you get to your destination, if you brought them with you, they wouldn't work anymore. They'd just be eyes. Now, the wizards have found a way to partially get around this, in that there's sort of a ritual that you can set up where you bind 2 eyes to one another. They don't actually have to be from the same creature, but conceptually it's really nice if you killed an abomination with 2 eyes and got the 2 eyes, and then you bind them in this sort of ritual, and you set it up so you spend one when you cast the teleport, and then it allows you to set up this little, just like a little shrine-y sort of thing at the other end with the second eye, and because of the link, that eye is not used up in the casting. So now, you could use that second eye as long as you were just teleporting right back to where you came from. So, with 2 eyes, you could do a 2-way trip. But even then, you can't just spend one eye, teleport, and then still be able to go wherever you want with the other eye. It can only be used to go back the same way. I find it important in most games, especially if you're starting at the lower level. I just really like to make teleportation more expensive, because it's kind of too easy a form of travel. It's good that some form of teleportation exists, so that if the plot demands it, people can get from one part of the world to another basically instantaneously. But if teleporting is too easy, then it rapidly becomes the only mode of transportation. By the time your characters are level 11 or 12, they aren't going to go anywhere that's more than an hour away without just being like, no, Have the wizard teleport us. I don't like to walk. Riding for an hour makes my butt sore. And traveling is a part of D&D, is part of having a fantasy world, is part of making it feel like a world. So setting it up so that most of the time they have to travel from point A to point B in some sort of a physical manner, usually. I find that it really helps to enforce that feeling of a world. And of course, you can always come up with ways later to make teleporting a little easier or to get around some of these things. And then those things can become important plot points. Just like in a world with no teleportation, if you suddenly found something that could teleport, even if it was only like one use, that would be amazing. So you can get some of that feeling and just create I create sort of a hybrid system. And usually anytime I make a setting, I come up with some restriction. The last setting that I made, prior to this one, I had a setting. The campaign didn't get as far as I would have liked, and it got broken up. But I had made it was an even lower magic world, and it was actually a low monster world. It's kind of funny that they had legends of orcs being these like super strong, amazing creatures, and they weren't actually. It's just that nobody had seen an orc in hundreds of years, and they were rare even then, so they had grown into this tall tale. I thought that was hilarious at the time, and it's kind of funnier now when you compare it to my current setting, where the orcs actually are, like, badass. But, where was I going? Yes, teleport. In that setting, what I did was, I didn't put a cost on teleport. Now, it was a lower magic setting, so very few NPCs would be powerful enough to cast teleport in the first place. It would be exceptionally rare. You're talking a handful in the world. But also, in that setting, any spell that completely ignored distance, like teleport and scry being the main ones, if you cast one of those spells, then anyone else who knows how to cast one of those spells and is high enough level to cast it instantly becomes aware of the target of your spell. So there's this crazy dynamic between the powerful beings in the setting, the actual top-end spellcasters who would be like level 9 or level 11, that's really high-level spellcasters in that setting. They have this difficult sort of power balance poker thing going on, right? Because if you want to know something and you want to scry to find out, everyone else who knows scry doesn't even have to cast it to know where you were scrying, where the target of your scrying was. It doesn't show them what you see, but they could then cast scry themselves on that same area, presumably, and they wouldn't be giving away any information because they'd just be looking where everyone already knows that someone is looking. But you, who originally casted, who wanted the information in the first place, would be giving away where you were looking for that information. And then you can get into mind games where you could scry something just for the purpose of throwing off those other few powerful players. And similarly, this means that if you were high enough level to teleport, if you teleport somewhere, all the other people who can cast teleport would know where you teleported to, which means they would know where you are now. And that means they could scry that spot, and they, again, wouldn't be giving away any information because everyone who was that powerful would already know that you teleported there, unless there was someone who is high enough level to cast scry and not high enough level to cast teleport. But whatever. I thought that was a really cool way to do it. There was also a little bit of name-dropping from the dwarves, which again the players didn't think to ask about. But when Greypike was giving an example of high-level wizards, my ears would have perked up if I were a player and it was like, who are the high-level wizards again? And the names he gave were Madrigail and Crystalfoot. They're both famous figures in the world. Madrigail is a powerful elven wizard, and Crystalfoot was an extremely powerful halfling scion. Crystalfoot is dead. Madrigail, being an elf, is still alive, because it doesn't matter how much time passes. They were both very, very important, albeit in sort of secret ways that these dwarves and most people probably wouldn't have heard of. They were involved in the actual Illud Rebellion, the initial 300 years ago when the Illud split off from the Diluvian Empire. The group of conspirators who were trying to form this rebellion were so worried about Diluvian spies and conspirators and ferreting out moles in their organization that they actually turned to surface dwellers very secretly and got Madrigail and Crystalfoot to come in and help them to ferret out any moles in their ranks, and to provide other kinds of covert assistance in setting up a climate where they could split off from this incredibly powerful empire. At the time, Crystalfoot, Madrigail, and the elven rulers felt that it was worth the risk, it was worth helping these pretty disreputable seeming people, because it seemed like there was some hope that it could weaken the Diluvians a lot, if successful, and there was some hope, and certainly the Illud did everything they could to bolster this hope, that the Illud nation would be much more humane and civilized, and, a viable partner with the surface nations. You can debate the degree to which that was true. The Illud also got some magic items. Illud also, after the initial coup, managed to negotiate and get a whole bunch of reasonably powerful magic gear to outfit the 2 monasteries that split off from the Empire to join them, because their monitors were severely outnumbered, and that was going to be a big deal in whether the revolt would be able to sustain itself and continue to exist. Interestingly, that was 300 years ago. In the present, Madrigail is known as one of the greatest critics of the Illud. He's feeling very disenchanted by their progress or lack thereof on the human rights front. Some would argue that the Illud are still much, much better than the Diluvians in terms of the way they treat slaves and many other facets of their civilization, but it's equally valid to argue that they have not done as much as they could and should have, and that they're still heavily reliant on slaves and the slave economy. And Madrigail has become kind of their biggest opponent. There's an annual or biannual peace conference that's held at Blue Mountain, which is a mountain right on the south coast of the Elven lands that the elves have officially given sovereignty of that mountain to the Illud as a sort of a peace thing, and they hold a peace conference there, I think every 6 months. I could be forgetting my own info. And certainly once a year, leaders from all the land nations, or highly placed representatives of those leaders, come to the peace conference, and they are always negotiating with the Illud. And it feels kind of like when the United States has a big conference and negotiates with China over all kinds of trade and military sort of issues. Only it's even more tense and higher stakes because they need the Illud to survive. They need the Illud to not lose the war that they're in. Many of the land nations don't want the Illud to win the war, but they sure as hell don't want them to lose. And you get these really weird scenes where the Illud negotiators, they're always incredibly effluent in their praise of Madrigail, and extremely polite and reverent of him, even when he comes out and has these incredibly caustic arguments about their horrible lack of progress. And it creates a really tense and kind of fascinating dynamic when they have their negotiations. Crystalfoot, obviously, he's dead. Halflings live about as long as humans, maybe even less. But Crystalfoot was a very interesting figure in their recent history, particularly since he lived way longer than should ever happen for halflings. The way I run things, you have all these fantasy races, and they usually have longer lifespans than humans. And I tend to say, dwarves can live up to 400 years, but normally a dwarf doesn't live past about 200 or 210 or something. That's still very long-lived for a dwarf. When you get to the ones who live to be like 400 years old, it tends to be ones who are individually very exceptional. You get that kind of sense. It's actually a feeling you get from some of that like biblical stuff. I mean, it's a little silly in the Bible when they say, like, Noah lived 900 years or whatever, and some of these other people. But in a fantasy setting, that kind of works. That idea that, most dwarves live to be less than 200 years old. So you get, this one is 210. He's like an old man, very revered. He's considered a wise elder. And then you get the occasional one who lives to be like 300, and that guy is an epic, legendary figure, or one who lives to be 400. That's amazing. Normally you don't get that so much with halflings. Normally, like, those edge cases would still be like, 120, 130. That would be super old. Similar to humans in a fantasy setting like this, there have been 1 or 2 humans who live to be like 120 or 130. Although actually not the Smith, because he died in combat. Shock. But Crystalfoot lived well over 200 years. He lived so far beyond the lifespan that a halfling should ever have. He had grandchildren who died of old age before he died. He was revered. He was kind of like their Yoda. But again, we'll hear more about him eventually. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them on the Seldom Used forum or post a comment below.